So to kick things off, my talk today is going to be called An Eye on Salt Pollution. And as Allison mentioned, I work for the Izaak Walton League of America. If you're unfamiliar with the league, we're one of the oldest conservation organizations in the United States. We were founded in 1922 by a group of hunters and anglers looking to conserve habitats for the future. So Salt Watch is one of our clean water programs aiming to conserve water. Across the United States, every year we use between 20 to 30 million tons of road salt every year, depending on the winter weather conditions. And so that's what we're here to talk about today is salt, specifically that road salt. And you might be wondering, what exactly is road salt? What is it made of? There's four typical types of road salt that are used. There's sodium chloride. It's the same thing as table salt, but with a couple more additives. And it's the most common and least expensive type of salt that's being used on our roadways, sidewalks, and parking lots. There's also potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, and calcium chloride that are used too. And something that I'd really like to preface during this talk today is that we are not anti-salt. We need to use salt in order to stay safe in the wintertime against sort of those slips and falls, but we need to be a little bit more mindful about the amount of salt that we use every year. Again, I mentioned we use between 20 to 30 million tons of road salt every year. So let's try to find ways together to cut back because there are some big impacts that this salt has on the environment, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. And salt is typically applied in one of two ways, as rock salt, which is that granular salt. It's really concentrated. You can see that on the photo on the left there coming out of the back of the truck. And there's also a brine application, which is a saltwater mixture when salt is sprayed on the roadways, like those lines that you see there on the right-hand side of the screen. And there's pluses and minuses to using both applications, but the sort of application that's the best practice that you'll hear probably a lot more of during the Wednesday conversations from the public works perspectives is that brine application is really one of the best practices that applicators use during the winter time. And there's a lot of misconceptions around road salt. A lot of folks think that more salt equals more melting and that you should feel the crunch underfoot as you're walking around during the winter time. And really salt, it needs space in order to be most effective at melting. So if you're looking at these photos here on the screen, that photo on the left sometimes is what we're used to seeing out there as we're walking around during the winter time, but really that is way too much salt. Again, salt needs space in order to work most effectively, so those salt granules should really be spaced out about 3 inches apart in order for them to be the most effective at melting. And a lot of times also seeing that amount of salt that we're seeing there on the left-hand side of the screen, where it's just a really egregious amount of road salt, a lot of times that is sort of the precedent that we expect to see during the winter time. And so sometimes our over-application of road salt, it's a public perception issue as well of how much salt are we expecting to see during the winter time. But again, that photo that you see there on the right, where there's not very much salt in that picture, and we'll go over sort of the amount of salt that really you should apply, especially if you are a homeowner at the very end of this presentation. A little bit of salt really goes a long way in order for its melting capacity. And this is really important too, because it only takes 1 teaspoon of salt to permanently pollute 5 gallons of water. And the reason we're using the words permanently pollute here is there's really no feasible way to remove salt from the environment. Once it enters the environment, it goes into our water, it goes into our groundwater, it goes into the soils, maybe some plants uptake it. It's really, really hard to remove it once it enters the environment. If you're going to the store to purchase salt, you're probably buying salt in about a 50-pound bag. A 50-pound bag of salt is enough salt to permanently pollute 10,000 gallons of water, which is about the size of a residential swimming pool. So not only does a little bit of salt have a really great melting capacity, but also it has potential to do quite a bit of damage in the environment. And we'll go over some of those things that it does today. It impacts all sorts of things like wildlife, infrastructure, drinking water, habitat, and pets, and so much more as well, beyond what we're seeing here on the screen. For wildlife impacts, salt does impact fish, but smaller organisms like macroinvertebrates, those little stream bugs that you're seeing at the bottom of waterways, plankton, microbes, all of those things might be even more sensitive than fish. Vernal pools, which are waterways or sort of seasonal depressions that are filled with water after the snow melt at the end of the winter or very early spring. Those can be very intensely affected, as well as the organisms, those really sensitive amphibians like frogs and toads and salamanders that use those areas to breed. Vernal pools don't really have a discharge point, so any salt, any chloride that enters the water, it is going to hang around for a really long time. And then, of course, migratory fish might not be able to find spawning ground due to elevated salinity. So they might have to go further upstream in order to find good ground to spawn. There's a number of infrastructure impacts as well. Chloride is incredibly corrosive, and I keep saying the word chloride. If we were to go back to that first or second screen where I show the different types of salt that we're talking about, all of those salts contain chloride. And so I'll probably use the word salt and chloride interchangeably throughout this presentation today. So it's very, very corrosive. It impacts our roadways like pavement, our bridges, any sort of concrete surfaces, cars, culverts, pipes, appliances, stormwater infrastructure, those big water mains and things, and so much more. And depending on what is damaged after salt is applied, it is estimated to cost up to $17,000 in damages after salt application. So if the 1 ton of sodium chloride costs around $73, it might take 200 some dollars to apply that salt, and then there might be up to $17,000 in damages after the impact. So there is a really long-term associated cost of road salt, even if the initial cost of purchasing that salt and maybe applying it is rather low. So something to sort of look forward to, or not forward in a positive sense, but look ahead towards, is that there's more damages that salt is having to our infrastructure in the future than just how much we're applying right now. And another thing to note too, it does impact our drinking water. Chloride is typically not removed by water treatment plants due to the high cost of removing it. And then also a lot of those water treatment plants might not have the infrastructure to remove chloride from the water. And as I mentioned in one of my previous slides, sodium chloride is the most commonly used road salt that is applied. And so that sodium is also not being removed by those water treatment facilities. So anyone who's on really low sodium diets due to things like hypertension, they might not realize that they're getting additional salt in their drinking water. And so that can be a really big problem, especially for people who are on dialysis for their kidneys. Any sort of water that has high salts in it really cannot be used for dialysis treatment. And again, as I mentioned earlier, chloride is really corrosive. If we think back to 2014, that's when the Flint water crisis began in Flint, Michigan. And road salt was actually one of many factors that led up to that crisis. There's a number of things that went wrong in that situation, but essentially, the water source for the residents of Flint, Michigan was switched directly to the Flint River in April of 2014. And so the chlorides were really high due to the winter salting winter prior. And so as that water was being pumped to residents, there weren't the appropriate anti-corrosive measures that were put in place. And so that chloride, that salt, was able to actually corrode the interior of pipes. And that's how all of that lead ended up in people's drinking water. And so this can be a really big problem. And I know in our area, we've had a number of water main breaks throughout the winter already. Salt is one of those factors that could be a reason for some of those breaks to occur as well. And then many of us as well are not on city water. A number of folks are on well water. Well water is something that's not regulated by the government. It's really on your plate to do the testing of that water. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And this is really, really important. This graphic that I'm showing, it might be a little bit blurry on your end, and I apologize for this. These two graphics are from our local water treatment facility, WSSC Water, and they have shown just incredible increases in chloride in our two major source waters for the region that I'm in. I'm speaking in Gaithersburg, Maryland, so close to Washington, D.C. And so our two source waters are the Potomac River and the Patuxent River. And so there's been a 41% increase over the past 30 some years in chloride in the Potomac River and a 102% increase in chloride in the Patuxent River over the past 30 years. And this is something that's certainly applicable to many areas of the United States because more than 117 million Americans depend on local streams for drinking water. And so something a lot of people don't realize with the road salt issue is we don't think about where that salt goes after it's being applied. Again, it ends up in our water eventually, and a lot of that water is what we use for drinking water. So some more things to think about. And then, of course, habitats can be impacted. Plants, especially the ones that are next to sidewalks and parking lots and roadways, they're really at risk of drying out, of desiccating from salt either being sort of splashed over onto them or from maybe snow piles that might contain some salt being stored on top of some of these plants as well. And so that can be a big issue, especially for like planted rain gardens and all sorts of stormwater infrastructure that involve plants. And of course, as the soils sort of become inundated with salt, the salty soil is less likely to retain water and can become compacted as a result as well. And something that a lot of researchers are starting to do some studies on is that chloride is being found to mobilize heavy metals in the environment as well. So keep an eye on updated research on that front. And then there are a number of pet impacts too. A lot of folks, they notice salt in the winter, especially as they're out walking their dogs. Dogs don't really like to walk on it. It's very pointy. And if they're licking their paws after walking around outside in the salt, they can become poisoned from that salt, dehydrated. Their paws and skin can become irritated and all sorts of things that we don't want to have happen to our pets. So certainly a lot of impacts to a lot of different things in our lives. Our story from Salt Watch started in 2017 when this large road salt spill that you see here on the screen occurred right outside of our national office headquarters in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And this spill was actually located on top of a storm drain that led down to a local waterway, the Muddy Branch, which eventually leads into the Potomac River, which is a drinking water source for millions of Americans. We didn't really know at the time who was responsible for this road salt spill. Was it the city, the county, the state, a private applicator? And we called a number of different organizations, and eventually, within 24 hours, the salt spill was cleaned up. But unfortunately, the damage to the stream below was already done. We had been monitoring the site really below where this salt spill had happened for a number of years. One of our benthic programs, Save Our Streams, has been around since 1969. So we've been certainly monitoring this site for quite a few years for both macroinvertebrates, but then also some chemical tests as well, and chloride was included in that. And really overnight, the chloride levels spiked from about 30 parts per million or milligrams per liter to really off the charts of what we were able to measure. So over 600 milligrams per liter of chloride, which is considered to be chronically toxic for freshwater aquatic life. And so with the success of some of our other programs, like our Save Our Streams program, we decided to launch the Salt Watch program because we realized that we didn't really know what to do in this situation confronted with this large salt pile. And so the average individual probably also would not have that same information as well. So Salt Watch was launched in 2018 to raise awareness in the general public about the connection between salt and stream health. So really making that connection that not only is salt a pollutant, but where does it go once it is applied? And why is this a problem? Why should we really care about this issue? We're also trying to identify chloride hotspots in fresh water. As part of our program, we send out Salt Watch kits, which are free test kits for anyone interested in testing local waterways or even your tap water for road salt pollution. And we're trying to make this really as easy to access as possible. And I'll talk a little bit more about our data here in a moment. And another thing we're trying to do is to advocate for smarter application of road salt by sharing the results of our program with private landowners and local and state agencies. So really trying to make differences here on the ground. And as I said, you can get a Salt Watch kit. You can go to our website, saltwatch.org, and we'll mail you a kit to your address. Each kit contains 4 test strips, instructions for how to take a sample, instructions for how to upload your data, and then that white card that you see there on the screen on the left is a conversion chart where you convert the units of the test strips into chloride. So you can immediately, within about 5 minutes or so, find out what the chloride levels are of your water. And we wouldn't be able to do this without our Salt Watch partners. Across the United States, we have 71 official Salt Watch partners and over 600 participating organizations. And many of these organizations are involved really all week this week in Winter Salt Week and are doing a lot of events at the end of the week. So again, go to the website wintersaltweek.org to find out if there's an event near you that you can participate in. Since the inception of our program in 2018 until just, I think, yesterday, we've received over 27,000 data points from 37 states and Washington, D.C. have submitted data. And I'll show you our map here in a bigger screen here in a moment. And something that I really want to point out about our program is that there are more of us community science monitors than there are monitors within the government. And so we're really trying to help them to identify a lot of those hotspots and problem areas that are really in need of further testing. And it's really important because it really does give you a voice to be able to find out what's really happening in your backyard. As you're looking at this map here, you'll notice that there's a bunch of different colored dots everywhere. The green dots we consider to be excellent, anything between 0 and 30 parts per million or milligrams per liter chloride. 27% of the samples that we've received across the United States have been considered excellent. And again, this is a nationwide program. And so I know that in many areas of the country, there are varying levels for what really is sort of a more acceptable level of chloride. I know in places like Maryland, for instance, chloride levels really shouldn't be over 50 milligrams per liter, parts per million. And so it does vary. So again, since this is a national scope, that's how we have this scale here on the right. 41% of the samples that we've received are fair, between 30 and 100 parts per million. It's said that anything over 100 parts per million is considered to be anthropogenically caused, although we know that in many areas that number is quite lower. Again, like Maryland shouldn't be, it's pretty concerning when chloride levels are over 50 parts per million or milligrams per liter. 19% of the samples are considered poor, between 100 and 230 parts per million or milligrams per liter. And then anything over that 230 parts per million or milligrams per liter is considered to be toxic to freshwater aquatic life, whether that's chronically toxic at 230 parts per million or acutely toxic at 860 parts per million or milligrams per liter. So 13 of the data points that we've received have been toxic. And SaltWatch is a year-round monitoring program. And so these data points are from all year round. And again, 37 states and Washington, D.C. have submitted data. As we're looking at this map, you'll notice that especially more metropolitan regions, especially more northern metropolitan regions, they tend to have higher levels of chloride. The dots are more red and orange in those areas. That is because there's a lot of impervious surfaces in those areas from all of the sidewalks and parking lots and roadways, whereas more rural areas tend to have less high chloride concentrations nationally. All of this data goes into the Clean Water Hub, and it's something that you can check out as well. You can look at our maps and our data at cleanwaterhub.org. It's our national water quality database, and the instructions for the SaltWatch kit, this is where that data goes. It's publicly accessible, created with usability in mind. The data is meant to be easy to access, understand, and share, and we have a number of different color-coded and interactive maps. And the data, it's shared with the US EPA annually for some of our programs. All of our programs data goes into here. It's available to government agencies, internally, externally facing. We use it in our annual report for updates to volunteers, for outreach to media sources, et cetera. And then for you as clean water advocates, you can use this data for letters to the editor, contacting local representatives, and educating community members. And we're really hoping that you take this data and turn it into some sort of action. That is really the goal of our program, is to really get people involved and turn that data into some sort of action, whether it's signing up for an action alert, to send in some information to our local representatives or state representatives to let them know, hey, I want to see more road salt reduction bills at the state level within this state. Whether it's writing an opinion piece to the Washington Post, there's so many things that you can do. And we try to provide those resources to you. We have different fact sheets and flyers and advocacy guides and resources in Spanish and template letters, as well as specific toolkits to faith-based communities and Izaak Walton League chapters. We also have a really cool Paint the Plow program toolkit as well that you can use. But it really does start at home. So if you take anything away from this presentation today or anything away from this whole week, shovel early and often, clear those walkways before snow turns into ice. You might even sweep after you shovel to really get down to bare pavement. Scatter salt. A 12-ounce mug of salt, your typical coffee mug, holds enough salt to salt a 20-foot long driveway or 10 sidewalk squares, which is about 2 parking spaces. And then something a lot of people don't know is you can sweep up any excess salt, store it in a closed container, and use that during the next storm event. And that really helps you to reduce the amount of chloride and road salt that's going into the environment, but it also saves you money because you get to not really throw out that salt, but use it again. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to visit our website, saltwatch.org, or email me at saltwatch@iwla.org. But please also go to wintersaltweek.org to find out if there's any events that are local to you, and to check out some of the webinars later in the week as well, because there's going to be so much excellent information and a lot of really regionally specific information as well. So I think there might be a little bit of time for questions. So I'll go ahead and stop my share. And again, if you have any questions, put those in the chat, or feel free to email Allison, and we'll try to answer those right now.
All right, Abby, awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody who is putting questions and comments into the chat. I'm going to put my email in the chat once again, if you want to use that as a way to send in your questions. So we did have one question that came in about alternatives to salt. And in the chat, Abby, while you were speaking, I just threw out there that, airports are a place where we see salt alternatives, non-chloride deicers used so that we protect that infrastructure, right? And so I did mention CMA, calcium magnesium acetate, and potassium formate. There's also potassium acetate. There's a whole bunch in that kind of acetate formate family. Do you want to talk about some of the other alternatives or additives for people? And we'll see if we have some more questions come in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know some folks put beet juice as sort of an addition to salt. It doesn't really help with melting too much per se, but it helps with some refreeze. So that's something. I think for our program's purpose, what we're really trying to promote is just using less of salt. Just a little bit of salt goes a really, really long way. And then also at a certain point, salt isn't really as effective. So especially down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, sodium chloride isn't the most effective at melting anymore. And so in a lot of those cases, if you have a bunch of ice, you might think about applying something that creates traction. I know some people have used sand and birdseed and kitty litter, all sorts of things, but I would recommend similar to the salt, if a storm event has passed, I still recommend sweeping those things up just to make sure that there's no sedimentation effects that are happening within not only our stormwater infrastructure, but then also any streams and things as well.
Well, no, thanks, Abby. Yeah, and I have to jump in there and say that I was really shocked this summer. I had somebody stay with me who is from Germany, and when I was trying to explain my work to him, he didn't quite get it, didn't compute, because he said, you know, in Germany where I live, you cannot put salt down on the sidewalks. That's illegal to do. That all goes into our water. So there, all you can do is you shovel, you sweep, and you, if you need to put something down for traction, but you know, they want to protect their water resources, and so they say no, no to salt. And Abby obviously is saying, you know, if we're going to just kind of let's be more moderate and mindful. But yeah, trying to really kind of get outside of the norms, you know, that we have here, and norms around at this point kind of overuse of salt. So I do see that we have a question on here about Wyoming, and there was a map, a map with a green dot on it in Wyoming, and Anita's wondering if that was in Casper, Wyoming. Do you know?
I would have to look that up. And again, you can go to the cleanwaterhub.org and you can actually look at that map. You don't need an account or anything, and you should be able to find out more information about some of those data points.
All right, cool. So Anita, hopefully you got that. And I did drop the link to the Clean Water Hub in the chat. So hopefully that works too. And then let's see, Sandra has a question about how would you suggest homeowners to spread sand when it's below 15? Like how much and any method of spreading?
I am certainly not an expert on that. I would say I wouldn't completely cover everything with sand, but probably again, similar to salt, a little bit would probably go a long way. I don't know, Allison, if you have more advice on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do use some sand at home sometimes. Um, and I just kind of scoop it up in a cup and do kind of like the chicken feed kind of scatter method until and then I kind of, you know, penguin walk over it and walk a few times. Like, do I feel safe? Do I think, you know, we should put a little bit more for someone who's maybe a little less steady on their feet? And then just kind of, yeah, I eyeball it. And then yeah, I do like if it melts, you can sweep that up again, or you know, if it goes into the lawn, it's not the biggest deal, right? I know that the city of Madison does spend a lot of money trying to pump out sand from some of their stormwater catchments, so it can cause some issues, but sand, at least where we are here in Wisconsin, you know, is naturally found, and salt is not. So, yeah, sand is a better option here. All right, so we do have a question from, let's see, I want to make sure I get the top one here. Mary, local businesses and the post office in our small town in central Minnesota are inundated with salt on sidewalks. They say they hire someone and don't have control over how much is put down. What would you kind of recommend? And
Yeah,
then
that's
I
a
have something to add to that too.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And something that I wish more people would ask, honestly, too. One of the big problems that we have across the United States is a lot of road salt applicators. They don't really have the knowledge of how much salt to apply, when to apply it. But even worse, a lot of times they're actually contracted by the number of pounds of salt or number of bags of salt per storm event. And so in a lot of those cases, a lot of those times it's actually up to the property owner, property manager, HOA, condo association, business owner to really make sure that when they're writing those contracts with those road salt applicators, they can actually put smart salting practices at the center of those contracts. And there are a number of contracts online that you can use as examples. And I think also if there's any possibility of getting in contact with those applicators and offering some free training programs for them as well would be my solution towards that. On that note, too, it's not scheduled yet, but I will have probably in March with another speaker later this week. A training on how to put those smart salting practices at the center of your contract that you're making with for hire road salt applicators.
All right. And I'm gonna drop into the chat here. I have like all these links I want to share. But one of them is Minnesota specific. Um, and that, well, yes and no. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency a few years ago worked to create a document with some recommendations for municipal ordinances. So kind of ideas for municipalities to create some ordinances to be a little bit more salt wise in their communities. So I'm going to drop that in there. I'll also drop in the city of Madison actually has an ordinance saying if there's extra salt left over on the sidewalk, so this is only true for public sidewalks, then the property owner is responsible to make sure that salt gets swept up or they can actually be fined. So that has led to a lot more education and outreach and training. And the city of Madison does work locally with Wisconsin Saltways. We put on a lot of different training events for contractors. So as Abby said, kind of getting those contractors trained, but sometimes, it's like going at, with the carrot and the stick, like how do we encourage them to come to the trainings? And then also SIMA, the Snow and Ice Management Association, does a lot of professional development with contractors like in the snow and ice world. So that would be another resource. They have a lot of best practices, but I'll drop some of those links in there and move along here to, let's see, we got some other questions coming in. So,
And while you're
um,
looking at that question too, Allison, I just want to put a plug too that there are a number of states that are working towards sort of limited liability protection for road salt applicators at the state level if they take and pass a state certification training and maintain those best practices and keep records of their application and the weather events and all sorts of things. And so giving those applicators more incentives like that would be something that's excellent. And I know a couple states have already introduced or will be introducing similar bills like that at the state level. And so definitely get in contact with your state legislators and let them know that this is something that you really encourage and support.
yeah, so I think, yeah, both kind of local as well as, yeah, state representatives. Great. And we've got, yeah, the webinar on Thursday will discuss a few different policy solutions. And like I said earlier, the hope is that we can see these things that are kind of bright lights and working, in specific communities or states and replicate that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here, right? We already have the bill language together. So with that, there was a question about water softeners. I don't know, Abby, do you want to touch on that at all? I'm going to put a couple links in, but
Yeah,
yeah.
I can start it,
Yeah.
and then if you have anything to add, feel free. Water softener discharge is another source of chloride pollution, and I know it's a pretty big source of chloride pollution, especially in Minnesota in many regions. And so I know there's some sort of reclamation programs of where people are actually taking the sort of discharge of that water softener and using it then as brine solution on roadways. So it's not sort of an extra pollutant in a lot of those cases. And I know there are different programs around the US trying to sort of reduce the amount of chloride that's coming out of those water softeners as well. And so there might be a program that's near you um, that has more information about that.
All right, so that was an additional thing there. The water softener brine reclamation. I just dropped that one in the chat, a YouTube with folks from the U.S. Forest Service, and in Madison, they are doing that, reclaiming that brine for use on site. And there's also a webinar during Winter Salt Week. I think it was Winter Salt Week 2023. I'll try to find here. That's all about water softeners. I dropped a link in about water softener blending valves, which is one way to allow a little bit of hard water through, because one thing people don't realize, when you put a water softener in, they're usually like factory setting is to take out all of the water hardness. So bring it from whether you're at 20 or 30 grains per gallon all the way down to 0. And again, in some European countries, that's illegal. You can't soften water down to 0 because we don't need to, right? A lot of us live in areas where we have a little bit of hardness in the water, maybe 8, grains per gallon, and that's fine. So why soften down to 0? It's like buying an air conditioning unit and putting it in and having it set at let's cool down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, who needs it at 50? Yeah, we want some cooling, but we don't need to do that, right? But it's this, forgotten appliance in the basement, and people don't really know what's going on there, this mystery appliance. So we are doing a lot of work through Wisconsin Saltwise in the Madison area with a wastewater treatment plant, a lot of education with plumbers and water softening professionals, so they know a little bit more, and it's not just this black box with the blending valves, as well as some of the alternatives, salt-free alternatives to the traditional salt-based water softener. So I will pull up another one of those. We do have a question from Sue. Sorry, this is a little hard to look at all these in a small screen here. Sue recommends check the contract. Is the billing by the amount of salt applied, which is, I think, what Abby just brought up, kind of those time and material contracts, right? They're typical, or is it for services on the property that meet shared goals? So it's definitely the latter, right? Is what we want to move to. As I mentioned, SIMA, the Snow Ice Management Association, has really been stepping up in recent years to get more education out there for contractors. I saw actually a really awesome social media post just yesterday. Winter Equipment, the company that makes plow blades, they had a contractor who went through the training program in New Hampshire talking about salt pollution. It only takes 1 teaspoon to 5 gallons of water, and they were talking about using better plow blades and working to scrape more. And if they're being paid for their service, we disincentivize, the over application of salt. I think a lot of people really take pride in doing that job well. But yeah, the contracts do matter there. All right, Alex said, roadside private contractors typically buy in bulk for large areas in Minnesota. We use a treated salt mixed with beet juice. Would this cause more negative effects? Do you want to jump on that, Abby?
Yeah, that's a good question. So beet juice is something that is organic, and like anything that we're really applying to our sidewalks and parking lots and roadways, anything that we apply is going to have some sort of impact. I believe that beet juice, it can have some negative impacts once it gets into our water. But I think it helps maybe to prevent corrosivity a little bit at least of the road salt as that's going down. So it's probably better for our surfaces, that pavement and concrete.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. From my understanding, sugar reduces corrosion, reduces the rate of refreeze, and it helps materials stick. So by and large, people are able to drop their salt down considerably by adding a little bit of sugar. While, we don't want to go around dumping sugar into the water, it's working to use the tools that we have, and that's one that we can use a bit more efficiently then, kind of when it's all said and done. But you, again, want to make sure that to do that, you have to calibrate equipment and then modify your application rates based on pavement temperature. So you're just applying what's needed. Okay. Thanks for sharing that though. Sarah Newman asked, what about an inspection process for applicator trucks so that equipment is distributing salt properly and not dumping huge piles along the route?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know a lot of the um, public entities around us, they do something that's called a snow rodeo or snowdeo during the winter time as they're going through calibration to prepare for the winter time. And so that's what a lot of, especially departments of transportation, are doing, and that we're hoping that a lot of our private applicators are doing is really checking those calibrations in the sort of the fall right before they need to apply anything during the winter time, but also calibrate it for each person too. For instance, if I'm using a push spreader, I might walk faster or slower than the next person. And so making sure that everybody is really familiar with that equipment and does check it throughout the year as well, but especially gets those calibrations ready during the fall, the season right before needing to apply salt.
Yeah, I was tempted to Google there and throw in some pictures of snowplow rodeos because they are very fun. I've actually gotten to drive a snowplow around during one of them to really celebrate a lot of the skill, technical skill and expertise that goes into these machines. You're not just driving, like operators, yeah, have a lot that they are mindful of or need to be mindful of when they're out there on the road. So yeah, I don't see any more questions at this time. Actually, I should double check my email that any came in that way. But I think we're good, Abby. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming and listening and sharing questions and thoughts. And yeah, really happy to take any other thoughts, comments that you have. You can always email me. Want to continue to improve this week and get information out. So appreciate you again being here. Appreciate you sharing these ideas with others so you can continue to share this link as well as share and promote it on social media. And then I would say, yeah, hopefully we see you later on in the week.
Thank you so much for having me too today, Allison. I'm really excited to kick off this week, and I'm so excited to hear from all of the other presenters and the events later in the week too, and see really what's happening and all of the different lessons learned and things as well. So thank you so much for putting all of this together, and thank you for everyone for being here today as well.
All right. Take care. Bye.